From the Toronto Star, I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. Locked in, under siege, exhausted, and fighting a deadly global pandemic. Pretty much everyone in the world right now has been waiting for just one message of hope. And today, Canada heard one.
It's been a difficult year, and we're not out of the crisis yet. But now, vaccines are coming.
We're almost there. The day is coming when Canadians will have access to a COVID-19 vaccine. 249,000 doses of Pfizer's vaccine will be in by the end of the month. The first shipment is set to arrive as early as next week. But before they get to Canadians, they have to get through Health Canada.
These vaccines don't get approved unless they are safe for Canadians. And if Health Canada approves these vaccines, then we will begin to deliver these safe vaccines to Canadians across the country.
Health Canada has not yet approved the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine candidate for the country, but they've been going through months of research and have indicated strongly they're getting close. So this might be a good time for some Vaccine 101. In today's episode, I'm joined by the top doc at Health Canada, Dr. Supriya Sharma. She's a senior medical advisor for the team working on these vaccine approvals, and she answers all your burning questions about how this vaccine is being assessed and what it might be like to take one. Hello, Dr. Sharma. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I know it's been an exceptionally busy time for you.
Well, thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with the vaccine process. How many vaccines are currently being analyzed by Health Canada? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, currently we have 4 vaccines under review, and review means that we've started the regulatory authorization review process. And those are the Pfizer vaccine, one made by Moderna, one made by AstraZeneca, and most recently the one made by Johnson & Johnson.
And can you tell me a little bit more about how these vaccines sort of differ from each other?
Sure. Well, with respect to COVID vaccines in general, there are different platforms, and the different platforms make the vaccines in different ways, but basically it all comes down to a very similar principle. So the coronavirus that causes COVID is named coronavirus because it has a little crown, and that crown is made of proteins on the surface of the virus that are called spike proteins. And through research, people have found that that's really the kind of the recognizing factor for coronavirus. So when you see that, you know that it's this virus. And all of the vaccines, through different methods, work by kind of making that protein, either doing it themselves, introducing that protein, introducing a virus containing the capabilities to make that protein, or in the most recent types of vaccines, giving the instructions to make that protein. And it goes into the body, it makes that protein, the body recognizes it as something that's foreign, that it needs to mount an immune response to get rid of, and it does that. And that means that that same person, the next time that they see the real virus, they already have that immune system ready to fight it off, and then the idea is that they wouldn't get sick. So all of the vaccines that are in development and that are currently under review have different ways of either providing instructions for that protein, providing the protein in another format, or doing another way to kind of set that immune response off.
Right. So the function is pretty much the same.
Right. And the 2 vaccines that are the furthest advanced in the review process use a new technology, and they're called mRNA vaccines. And so these vaccines actually send the instructions to make the protein to the body. And the reason that they're the first ones is that because that process is actually much faster than the development process for sort of traditional vaccines.
So Dr. Sharma, how does a COVID-19 vaccine get approved in Canada? Can you take us through the process?
Certainly. So there's sort of 2 processes. I mean, this is something we do every day as the regulator. We look at whether it's vaccines or medications, and there's a process to authorize it. The standards that we're looking at for the COVID-19 vaccines are the same standards that we would normally use, but we're using a process called the interim order pathway. And that interim order is a way that gives us some flexibilities in terms of how we do the reviews and gives us some other benefits as well. But basically, it allows us to take all the information that goes into the review and accept it in what we call a rolling submission. So normally what happens is that all of the information that we know about the vaccine, all of the data from the lab tests, all the animal studies, all the studies in humans, all those clinical trials, and all of the information about manufacturing has to be completed before it even comes into the regulator to start the review. And so what we do is that we still get that same information in, but we allow the companies to provide it to us as it's available. So we can get part of the information in first, and then as we get more information from the clinical trials, they can submit that. So that allows us to start looking at it earlier and hopefully shorten the overall time that it takes to do the review, and ultimately, if it all meets standards, and then it will get authorized.
And what about your team? Who are the people who review these vaccines?
So each vaccine, so what we've done is that we've actually have dedicated groups specific for COVID-19 vaccines. So our most senior reviewers, the ones with the most experience, we've put them in special teams. It takes we've averaged around about 2,000 person hours to do a review. An average vaccine review has hundreds of thousands of pages in it. And we have teams that look at each vaccine. And the teams are about 7 to 12 people on average. And they have a range of experience. So toxicologists, pharmacologists, microbiologists, immunologists, people with background in clinical medicine like infectious diseases, biostatisticians, epidemiologists. So as a team, they're looking at the vaccine, and then we get different pieces of it. And so different subgroups of those teams will look at the different subgroups of information, and then they would all come together on that final integration step to see if the vaccine can be authorized, which means that it's met the standard for safety and efficacy, so doing what it's supposed to do, and quality, and as well as overall that the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the potential risks.
And there are indications that it might be really close now, but do you have any timelines in mind? Like how long would it take for Health Canada to approve a vaccine and for it to start circulating?
The precise timing is difficult because it really depends on the review of the evidence. And because we're doing a rolling submission, it's not that we have the full package already, it's that we're getting information. And for the vaccines that are under review, especially when we're getting too close to the end of the review, we're getting information in every day. So the reason that it's difficult to say this is a specific day is because if the information that we're expecting to come in doesn't come in, obviously that might change it. If that information comes in and we have questions, that might change the timelines. If it comes in and it's all in order and we can review it relatively quickly, that might change it as well. So I can say with our first vaccine, we are close to the final steps in the process. The bulk of the information has been reviewed. So all of that preclinical, clinical information, we've gone through that. The final stages of any vaccine review, there's really critical pieces around the information that goes along with the vaccine, how the indications for use, any potential side effects, all the summaries of all the data that goes into that. And that's all in the labeling, as well as very detailed information on specific testing of specific lots. And the reason that that's important is because vaccines are more complicated to make than medications, for example. So they're derived from living organisms. There's lots of variability in the way that they're manufactured. And as a result, there's very stringent testing on each lot that comes out. So we need to have all of that information and make sure that all of that is in order before we're able to do the final authorization. But we are coming really to those final steps now.
And it seems like just a short while ago, we heard about these vaccines and now countries are on a fast track to roll them out. The UK has already approved the Pfizer vaccine. In fact, what would you say to those who are worried that the vaccine is being made and rushed out too fast?
I kind of feel it with respect to the regulatory process. We only have two speeds here. It's either too fast or too slow in people's minds. I want to let people know that it's not too fast or too slow. It's just right based on the information that we're seeing. One thing on the UK authorization is that, their authorization was a little bit different than the one we're looking at in Canada, in that it was a temporary authorization of one specific lot. They did look at the same clinical information. We work very closely with them as we do with all of the other international regulators. But it's also important when there is an authorization to make sure that we understand what that is. I can totally understand where people are coming from about, having questions. I think there's a lot of uncertainties and there's a lot of new things that we're all dealing with. This virus is completely new. The way that we're living our lives is very new. Our response to it is all very new. And it's true, if we had looked back a year ago, people were saying, it'll be 2 years before we get a vaccine. And so now people are seeing, well, hold on, it's a year. How can we make sure that we haven't cut any corners and that the vaccines are safe? And most importantly, that someone should get it, right? So as we said before, a vaccine is one of those things that even the best vaccine is only effective if people trust it and ultimately agree to receive it. So I can see where people are coming from. But what I wanted to say is that when we're talking about how quickly these vaccines were developed, and they were developed incredibly quickly, but it really is a marvel of science. Like the geek in me is so floored by all of this progress. And the other important thing to kind of realize that people may not be as familiar with is that when you have vaccines that are being developed, there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of time where you're waiting for things. Researchers put in multiple grant applications and wait for them to get funding. Companies, go through a lot of processes before they can dedicate resources to that. Even through the development process, the time that it takes to actually get the clinical trial up and running and completed is often much, much longer because there's not that sort of dedicated collaboration that's on this. But the other part of it is just the nature of the pandemic. We have people that are signing up to be participants in clinical trials, so that recruitment process has been much faster. And although this is not where we want to be, the fact that we do have countries and places in the world where we have a lot of circulating virus and a lot of COVID-19, that's actually made the clinical trials go much faster because the clinical trials are set up to see if one group of people that get the vaccine have far fewer cases than another group that don't get the vaccine. And we only get to those numbers when we have a lot of people in that group that doesn't get the vaccine that actually, get the disease. So I think although it's been a very rapid process, it's still a very rigorous process. And the most important thing is that the authorization. So the Health Canada authorization that has to happen before any vaccine goes into any arms is the same process. Like we still have very strict standards. We're still making sure that they meet those standards for safety and efficacy and quality. That has not changed. So even though it's been an overall quicker process all around, they should still have faith in that process and know that no vaccine would get into any sort of distribution until it's met those standards.
We'll be right back. Dr. Sharma, based off of the clinical trials and whatever has been researched so far, what would it feel like to get the COVID-19 vaccine? Would it be kind of like the flu shot, or would it be more painful? Are there any potential side effects?
Well, the side effects of these vaccines are very similar to the sort of short-term side effects of a lot of other vaccines. So in the studies, the most commonly cited side effects are a bit of irritation or soreness at the injection site and some general symptoms, either fatigue or feeling generally a little bit unwell or a little bit of muscle ache. They've all been short-lived and they've all disappeared fairly quickly. There are some reports that some people are having a bit more reported fatigue with a second dose. Most of these vaccines, it's not just one dose, it's 2 doses. But in general, they're very similar to, as you said, the flu vaccine in terms of the types. I think, obviously we're going to be monitoring these vaccines as we start to do the rollout. And part of the information that we collect is really those sorts of effects as well. So as we go, we'll have more information beyond the clinical trials on what types of side effects people are seeing.
And obviously, as you mentioned, you're still monitoring the situation and we will still find out a lot over time. Do we at this point have any indication or idea if the vaccines are safe in the long term?
So we will be monitoring them. All the companies, in terms of the international standard that we're all looking at, there's a requirement to continue to monitor the virus for 2 years after the initial authorization. In the clinical trials, we do have information from those. From the phase 1 trials, we're now, we have for some of them, months, 4 or 5 months of data. It is important to know that we, will be looking for potential long-term side effects, but the entire process to develop the vaccine and the review process is to weed out any candidates that might have those. So, what we can say is that based on the science and based on the clinical trials, we are not seeing any major long-term side effects. We can never say that that's zero. And that's why it's important to continue to monitor them.
And is there some kind of criteria that the experts are working off of? What would it take for them to say, no, we're not approving this for Canadians, or to approve the vaccine? What's the parameter?
Yeah, ultimately authorization, I know it sounds oversimplistic sometimes, but it's really, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And that's the kind of balance that we're always looking for, regardless of what the authorization is. So for something like chemotherapy, for example, that's used to treat cancer, obviously when we're looking at benefits and risks, we'll tolerate some sort of side effects that potentially are quite severe, because the potential benefits are curing a disease that somebody has that potentially could be fatal. It's always important to remember that for vaccines, when we're looking at benefits and risks, in this case for COVID-19, obviously the benefits would be preventing someone getting COVID-19 disease, but we have a very low tolerance for risks because these are for prevention. So these are going into, otherwise healthy people who do not have the disease. So we're really looking at potential risks in a way that's different for vaccines and for others. And we have a very low tolerance for that on the safety side. So when we're looking at this process, the safety issues really need to be sorted out before any authorization happens. When we're looking at the final authorization is overall, do the benefits outweigh the risks? If there are any potential risks, do we have a good system in place to monitor the vaccines as they go out and react very quickly should anything come up?
And would someone who already had COVID-19, for instance, would they still need to take this vaccine?
That's a bit of an unknown question right now. And in general, we would say yes. So we know that having the disease is likely to confer some immunity. We don't know how long that lasts, and we don't know exactly what kind of type of that immunity it is. So unless somebody has lab results that show that they have a very, very strong immune response already, in general, we would say even if people have had COVID-19, that it would be a good idea to get the vaccine. The vaccine presents things to the body in a similar way as if somebody had the disease, but it's almost a better way because it's a standard dose, it's in a standard format, it's been studied. Whereas with COVID-19, we know that anybody's individual response might be very different based on how much virus they were exposed to, how sick they got. So it's more variable in those situations. So in general, we would say yes, but in truth, we don't have a lot of data specifically in that population to know at this point in time.
And are you worried about people who might not feel comfortable or refuse to take the vaccine?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can understand that there are people that have, we talk about sort of vaccine hesitancy, but it's really interesting because I think, on one side, I can understand that there are a lot of people that are very anxious to get the vaccine, and see the end of circumstances that we're living under for COVID-19. Of course, I can understand that people have questions about the vaccines themselves because we're now giving the information to them about that. But it really sort of comes down to, again, one first step is having faith and having trust in not only the regulatory review process, but the science and the integrity that's gone into develop these vaccines, making sure that people know that there are appropriate checks and balances, that there's a good public health system that these are going into. And I think that hopefully will go a long way to, helping people understand and then ultimately accept this. The other thing is that, people are all different. We all look at situations differently. We all assess those level of risks differently. So that's why it's really important for us to be able to put out information in a variety of different formats, in a variety of different ways, so that people can take that information, can understand it, and then make those decisions that are best for themselves.
It's very interesting that you brought up that information aspect. And as you very rightly said, people have a lot of questions. And we know these are quite polarizing times. There's a lot of misinformation out there as well. There's been conspiracy theories. How are you finding ways of countering that now that work on the vaccine is starting? What kind of information and awareness are you going to build around this for the public? Is there some mechanism for some kind of a national campaign or something of that kind?
So, it's a whole group of people working together in terms of information, and there's different parts of the healthcare system, and there's different responsibilities. We're focused at the Health Canada side really around, the science of the vaccine themselves, obviously the regulatory review process with the Health Canada authorization means. We work very closely with our colleagues at the Public Health Agency of Canada that works towards putting out a campaign of information, and that'll get rolled out as we're rolling out the vaccine. The provinces and territories also have resources and are putting resources into doing education. It's important to remember this is not the only time that we're doing vaccines. We have obviously flu vaccination programs that roll out. We have our childhood vaccines that roll out. It's all of that information. I think, what it comes down to is that where do people get that information? What information do they trust? There's some studies that show that a lot of people really trust peers more than anything else. So, the people in your family, potentially people that you know personally. So I think it's really cascades of information, making sure that it's there, making sure that it's there in a variety of different formats, in a variety of different ways. And then people can draw upon that from trusted sources. And I can't underscore that enough. You mentioned about misinformation and disinformation, but anytime somebody sees something, I think they should look at it, question the source, question where it comes from, and then, be educated about what information is out there, and then be able to make, the appropriate decisions for themselves and for their families.
And with all this buzz of vaccines, a lot of people might also be thinking they can just go back to normal after receiving the vaccine. I wanted to ask you, even with the vaccine, there's some time before we can get back to normal or pre-pandemic times, right?
Absolutely. And so, what we're finding is that as the vaccines get authorized, as we go through and receive vaccines and we go throughout that rollout and distribution, all of that will take time. So all of that will take time. We have priority groups that will get vaccinated first. We'll receive more vaccines. We'll expand that. Gradually, we'll have that immunity that will be present in, enough of community members to hopefully slow and ultimately stop the transmission. But all of that will take time. And these vaccines, although, we've been very impressed with the data and the effectiveness of the vaccines, even if it's 90% or 95%, there's some people that may not necessarily get the full benefits of that vaccine. So we'll be going through a period of transition, but the hope is that, in that transition, the vaccines are an important step to making progress so that we can slowly start peeling back some of these public health measures. So we'll start to see measures being lifted around some of the measures around how many people can congregate together, inside versus outside, masks versus not masks, but that'll be a gradual process. So I don't have any doubts that we will get there, but it's important to know that people know that that's going to be a process. The vaccine, I think we're seeing is a very key part of that process, but it's only one part of it.
So let's conclude the conversation on that very hopeful note. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for your insight and for your time.
Well, thank you again for your interest in all of this important work. And please take care, and wishing all of your listeners the very best as we navigate through these extraordinary times.
That was Dr. Supriya Sharma. She's a senior medical advisor at Health Canada and oversees the approvals of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and, of course, vaccines. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.